Welcome back. Let's now talk about our first data structure, and that's going to be arrays. And let's say I wanted to store my friends' names in variables so that I could use them later in my program. And so with the knowledge that we have so far, this is how we would do it. So const friend1, let's say Michael, let's spell this correct, then friend2, Stephen, and then friend3, let's say Peter. Now, this isn't really fun to do, all right? Because imagine that we actually wanted to represent 10 friends, and then we would have to create 10 variables. So that doesn't sound like fun. Instead, wouldn't it be great to essentially bundle all of these values together into some bigger container? Well, that's why we have data structures in JavaScript, and arrays are such a data structure. So an array is like a big container into which we can throw variables and then later reference them. And that's super important because programming is most of the time all about data. So we get data from somewhere, we store and process data, and then we give some data back. And that data, it has to go somewhere. So it has to be stored in some place. And for that, we use data structures just like arrays. So in case we have more than just a single value. The two most important data structures, at least in JavaScript, are arrays and objects. And so now let's learn all about arrays. So instead of doing this, let's create a variable which I'm going to call friends. And then we use the brackets to create a new array. And then in there we can put different values separated by commas. And so let's now use the exact same friends. So Michael, comma, then Stephen, comma, and Peter. And make sure that these commas here are outside of the string. So that's an error I see people do. And so this needs to be one string. So you need to start and finish it, then the comma, and then another value, then another comma, and then another value. Okay, and now let's take a look at it in the console. Okay, and so this is what the array looks like in the console. So basically just as we wrote it in our code. And that is the absolute basics about arrays. So that's how we create one. At least that's the way that we use the most. But there's actually another way. So let me show that to you as well. So let's say we wanted an array of years. And so instead of the brackets, we could also write new array and then parentheses. And in there, we would then specify our values. Let's say 1991, 1984, 2008, and let's say 2020. So an array can hold as many values as we want, and also values of any type that we'd like. So it doesn't have to be strings like here. Of course, numbers work just the same. So here we used a different way of creating the array, which was using this array function. So you see that it's a function because we called it here, basically using these parentheses. And we also needed to use the new keyword, because otherwise it's not going to work. But anyway, it's way more usual to just use the brackets like I did up here, which is called the literal syntax. Great, so now we know how to create arrays, so basically how to put elements into an array, but of course we need to have a way to get them out. And for that we use the square bracket syntax again. So let's say that we want to log to the console the first element of this friends array. So that would be Michael. So console.log, and now we write friends. So that's the name of the array. And then we use the square brackets and then the number 0. That's because arrays are zero-based, which means that this first element is the element number 0, then this one is element number 1, number 2, and so on and so forth. And so if we want the element at position 0, so this first one, then we write friends, square brackets, 0. And that's it. And now let's say we wanted Peter here as well. So that would be element 0, 1, 2. And so let's just write 2. And check it out. And indeed, we get Michael and Peter. Cool. Now, we can also get the actual number of elements that is in the array. So let's also log that one to the console. And this one works by saying friends dot length. Okay? And this dot length is something called a property, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this section when we talk about objects. Anyway, what matters is that this is going to be the exact amount of elements that is in the array. And it's not zero-based, so it will not be 2, even though the last one here is element number 2. Instead, it really gives us the number of elements in the array. So we should expect this to log 3. And yeah, here we go. Now, we can use this to automatically get the last element of any array. And that is useful so that we don't have to count how many elements are in the array. So let me show you how we could do that. Friends, and then remember, to retrieve an element from the array, we need to square brackets. So just like this. And then to get the index of the last element in the array, all we need to do is friends.length minus 1. So friends.length minus 1. And that's because, again, friends.length is not zero-based. So this is 3, remember, but this last element is 2. And so we always need to subtract 1 from this number here. Okay? So what this also means is that inside of these brackets, we can put any expression. It doesn't just have to be a number, literally like we did here and here. So here we have this expression. And remember that an expression is something that produces a value. And so this one here is going to be calculated first. So it will compute friends.length, which is 3, minus 1 is 2, and then it will get friends at position 2. And that's also one of the reasons why it's important that you know what is an expression and what is a statement. Because once again, we could not put a statement in here. So inside of these square brackets, JavaScript expects an expression, not a statement. Anyway, we got the correct element from the array, which is the element number 2. And so that means that this automatic retrieval of the last element works just fine. All right. And moving on, there is more stuff that we can do. So this square brackets syntax that we used here is not only for retrieving elements from the array, but we can also change it to add elements to the array. So let's say that for some reason I'm no longer friends with Peter and that I want to replace him with some other friends. And so now we can change or mutate the array in the same way. So we can say friends at position number 2, and now I'm doing it manually here again. So we can say that this should be equal to something else. Let's say J. And if we now log this friends array to the console, then we should already see the new array. So friends, and let's see. And indeed, the element number 2, so this one here, is now replaced with J. Okay, so in the beginning, when we first logged the friends array to the console, it was still in this state, so it still had Peter, and that's why here in the beginning we still see that original state. But then as we move on through the code, at some point here, we change that array. And so when we then log the array again, that change is of course reflected here in the output. But wait, didn't I say in the last section that variables declared with const cannot be changed? And we did in fact declare the friends variable here with const, right? But I was still able to change one element of the array here from Peter to J, right? So isn't that a contradiction? Well, what I didn't tell you at the time is that only primitive values are immutable, but an array is not a primitive value. And so we can actually always change it, so we can mutate it. And it works this way because of the way that JavaScript stores things in memory. And once more, we will have a whole lecture just on that topic alone in a special section about how JavaScript works behind the scenes. So what you need to know for now is that we can actually mutate arrays even though they were declared with const. Now what we cannot do is to actually replace the entire array. So we cannot do this. We cannot say that the entire friends array should now be Bob and Alice. That would be illegal. So let's see. And now we get assignment to constant variable. And so that's why that we cannot do. But let's just keep it here anyway, so you get this as a reference. Next up, I want to show you that an array can actually hold values with different types all at the same time. So let's experiment with that. So let's create an array which holds all kinds of information about me. So let's say Jonas, so that would be the first name, then the last name, then the age, and here we can actually calculate the age from other values. And that works because in each position, JavaScript simply expects an expression. And so if we do this, then this is perfectly fine. Okay, so this will here produce a value, and so that's the value that will then be stored at position number 2 of the new array. And that also works for variables. So we could, for example, do first name equal Jonas, and then here instead of literally writing that, we could use this variable name. And so this would then be replaced with the actual string. So let's put some more data. And actually, we could even put other arrays inside of an array. So that's really cool. So let's put the friends array here in the Jonas array. And then with this, we have all the relevant data about Jonas in one handy data structure. And that's really convenient because then we don't have to create one variable for each of the data points. So let's, of course, inspect this now in the console so that you can see that all of these expressions here, basically, so this and this here and this, so all of them are going to be replaced with the values that they produce. And so, indeed, we now get Jonas, we have the calculated age, and here we have the array 3. And we can expand that by clicking on this small triangle here, and then we can see the actual array in here. We also have the length, so length is 5, and so that's where JavaScript gets this friends.length from. Jonas.length would of course also work, and it would be this 5 that we see here. Okay, so that's the one. Great, so these are the very fundamentals of arrays in JavaScript. And now just to finish this video, let's work on a very small array exercise so that we can see why arrays are actually so useful. And to do that, let's bring back our old forEach function. So it's got to be somewhere here. Yes, let's use this one. We've coded this so many times that I don't want to repeat it. So exercise. So forEach. And now let's say that we have an array of birth years. And then we want to calculate the ages for some of them. So a new array And let's say 1990, 1967, 2002, 2010, and 2018. And now we will be able to use the calcH function and then store the results of calculating the ages for some of these years into a new array. So let's see how. And let's see first how we could not do it. Okay? So, for example, if we wanted to use the calcH function for all of the elements in this array, we could not do this. This would be not illegal, I would say, but it's not going to work because this years is an array. And if we pass this years array as an argument to the calcH function, it doesn't know what to do with it because this operation here expects a single value. And we cannot do a number minus an array. So let me actually show you what's going to happen if we run this. And, well, that's not the error that I wanted to show you. So what we get is identifier years has already been declared. So this means that somewhere in the code we already have an array called years. And yeah, here it is. So let's change the name of this one to just Y. So that one doesn't really matter anyway. But now let's see what happens. And, well, not much did happen. So we actually need to inspect the result of this. So console.log and then the result of this. So let's see. And now we get the result, not a number. And so that's the result of attempting to subtract a whole array, which would be this years array, from a number. Okay, so let's actually do that here as well. Remember that we have access to all the variables that we declare in the script, also in the console. So that's the years array that we just declared. But years, for example, plus 10, does not work. At least not in a way that we expected it. So the plus operator, what it does here is to convert everything to a string, just like I showed you before. And so the string here is then basically this array as a string, and then it adds the 10 here. So that's not meaningful at all. And if we use it with minus 10, then it's even weirder, so we get not a number. So all of this is to say that we cannot really do operations with arrays. But we can still use the calcH function on individual elements of the array, of course. So let's do that. And we will assume that I want to calculate the ages for the first, the second, and the last array element. So this one, and this one. So let's calculate this and then store the result into a variable called h1. Then we need to get rid of this parenthesis. And so as I said, I want to calculate the age for this first element. And so what we do is to take years at position 0. And so this here will then basically be replaced with 1990. And then calcH is called with 1990, and the result is stored to age 1. Now let's do this some more times. And say h2, h3. And here I'm using 1. So remember, I want this, and the last one. But I don't want to count the number of elements in the array. And so I use that trick that I just showed you in the beginning, which is to first compute the length of the array. So years.length, and then -1 to account for the fact that the index of the array is 0-based. And now we can quickly check out if this actually worked. So h1, h2, h3. And yeah, so we got 3 values here, which are these 3 ages. But we can take this even a little bit further. So since we started with an array, it's usually a good idea to also end up with a new array. So let's create an array, const ages, And now what should I put in here? Well, remember how I said up here that any position of the array simply needs to be an expression, so something that produces a value. And as we already know, this here produces a value as well, right? It is an expression. And so I can take this and simply put it as a position in this array. And so JavaScript will then go ahead, compute this value, and place it in the array. So basically, we can place function calls into an array just fine, because they will produce a value. And now here, we need to again do years dot length minus 1. And now, finally, logging it to the console, and then we're done. And indeed, we get the 3 same values that we had up here separately, now all nicely placed into this array. And this of course works because JavaScript will start by running these function calls, these 3 function calls here, and then place all the results in an array afterwards. Nice! And I think that should be enough for one video. I hope that you see how fun arrays can be and how useful they can be. And in the next lecture, we will make them even more useful by doing some operations with them. JavaScript has some built-in functions that we can basically apply directly on arrays. And these are called methods, and we can think of methods as array operations, basically. So let's now learn some useful array methods. And there are actually countless array methods in JavaScript. And in fact, we have a whole section dedicated to arrays alone. That's how important they are in JavaScript. But in this video, we're going to learn just some basic ones that you really need to know. And also so that you start to get used to the idea of using methods on arrays. Now let's start by bringing back the friends array from the last lecture. All right. And now let's start with a method called push. So the push method adds elements to the end of an array. And so let's say friends dot and then push and then the element that we want to add to the end of the array. So let's say j here. So push is essentially a function, and we can see that by these parentheses. So it's a function that we call, and we call that function really attached to the friends array itself. And that's what this dot here stands for. All right. So again, push is a method, which technically is a function, and we call that function directly on the friends array. So the push function is kind of attached to the friends array. And if you're wondering why that is, we will once more learn that a little bit later in the course. But there is a good reason why this works, and it's actually pretty fascinating stuff. So I hope that you're excited to keep continuing to explore this course until you'll really learn how all of this actually works. Now, anyway, let's now check out the friends array in the console, because this is really all we need to do to add an element to the end of the array. And indeed, now we get the original array that we had before, plus the j element. And you see that the length is now also 4. Okay, so this actually changed, so it mutated the original array, but that's no problem at all, just like I explained you in the previous lecture. Remember that? All right. Now, since push is a function here, it can also return something. So we already know that we can pass arguments into functions, and we did that here with j. Then the function can do some work, and in this case, the work that the push function does is to add the element to the array. And actually the push function does return a value. And the value that it returns is the length of the new array. So if we want to capture that data or that value, we can create a new variable for that. So let's call it new length. And let's then also log it to console. And indeed, it is 4. So most of the time we actually don't do this. So we just push an element and call it a day, because usually we don't immediately need the length of the new array. But in case we need it, we don't need to then calculate it separately. We can simply take the result of this function here, store it into a variable, and then use that. Great. Now, besides the push method, which adds elements to the end of the array, there's also a method to add elements to the beginning of the array. So that is the unshift method. So unshift. And so let's say we wanted to add John right to the beginning of this friends array. So again, let's check it out. And so now it should have 5 elements, and the first one should be John. And yeah, it is. And just like the push method, the unshift method also returns the length of the new array. But in this case, we are just not saving it because we don't really need it. Next up, we also have methods to remove elements from arrays. So these one here, add elements. So let me just write that here. Add elements. And then we have some to remove elements. And let's start with the pop method, which is basically the opposite of the push method. So this means that pop will remove the last element of the array. So let's write that here. And this time we don't need to pass in any argument. And that's because there's no information needed really to just take out the last element. So let's try that. Oh, we didn't log it again to the console. So let's just grab it from here. And now you see that J is actually gone. And if we did it twice, for example, which of course we can also do, then Peter should also be gone. And indeed, we removed J and Peter. Now again, this pop method also returns something, but this one doesn't return the length of the new array, but instead it returns the removed element. And so that can sometimes be useful. So let's call this one popped, okay? And so let's log that one to the console as well. So that is the popped element. And we could do the same for this first call. But as I said earlier, we don't always do this because it's not always that useful. But here I just want to show you that it actually works. And so the popped element should now be Peter. So this first one here is J, and then the last one becomes Peter. And so here in the second pop call, Peter is the one that's being removed. And so that's the element that's then going to be saved into popped. And yeah, here it is. Okay. And finally, let's also remove the first element from the array. And so that's friends that unshift. So let's copy this one again. Give it a save. And so now only Michael and Steven should be left after all this manipulation, right? Oh, and actually that did not work. And that's because I did a mistake. So unshift is of course to add elements to the array. And so this one here is called shift and not unshift. So now it should work. Yeah. Once again, we didn't need any arguments. And once again, this method here will return the element that was removed. So if we need that, we can capture it. Next up, there is a very useful method that tells us in which position a certain element is in the array. So let's work with this small array that we have left. And what we want to log to the console now is friends.indexOf. And then we pass the element which we want to reference. So let's say we want Steven. And so, as I said, this should return the index at which this element is located. So we know that Stephen is right now element number 1, right? So 0 and 1, and we actually can see that here in the console. So 0 is Michael, 1 is Stephen, and so this index of function call should return the value 1, because again, that's the index of the element Stephen. And yeah, there we go. Now, if we try the same thing for an element that is not in there, let's say Bob, we will get -1. All right. And now finally, to finish this lecture, there is a very similar method to the index of, but which is a bit more modern and, in my opinion, also more useful. So this one is an ES6 method, and it's called includes. So includes, instead of returning the index of the element, will simply return true if the element is in the array and false if it's not. So let's check that. So friends.includes, and now we can actually do the same as up here. So let me just copy that. And the difference here is, again, the includes method. So let's see what we get now. And as expected, with Stephen, it is true, because indeed we have one element here, Stephen, but Bob is false, because, well, there is no element called Bob. And this method actually uses strict equality for this check. So let's say that we pushed some value here to this array. So friends.push, which, remember, will add a value to the end of the array. So if we added 23, and then if we checked for 23 the string, it would not work. So it would say false, right? And that's because it is testing with strict equality, which means that it does not do type coercion. And since 23 the string is different from 23 the number, it gives us false. But if I test it directly for the number, then it should be true. And yes, it is. So we added it here to the array, and so then of course the array includes it. That makes sense. And so we can use the includes method to write conditionals. So that's one of the very useful applications of this method. For example, just to test it out very quickly, let's say friends.includes Peter. And then, if so, we can log to the console, you have a friend called Peter. Okay? So we already know that this here returns a Boolean, and we also already know how the if statement works. And so only if this is true, so if the array does include a string with Peter, only then this code is executed. And so right now, of course, nothing happens. But if I ask for Stephen, then here let's say Stephen as well, then I get, you have a friend called Stephen. So that's probably the most used case of the includes method. All right, and that's all I had to show you for this lecture. And as I said in the beginning, there are many more useful methods for manipulating arrays. But for now, I just wanted to show you the most basic ones. And next up, there's yet another coding challenge waiting for you. Okay, and I'm going to start by creating the calctip function. And I'm going to start doing it with a function expression. So this one will receive a bill as an input, I believe. I think, yeah. So calctip takes any bill as an input. So let's simply call it bill. And then what we want to return is the tip. And here I'm going to write the exact same code as we did in the other challenge. So there's no need to explain it all again. It would just be a waste of time. So if the bill value is between 50 and 300, so less or equal than 300, and here we're using the ternary operator, then return the bill value times 0.15, so that's 15%, and otherwise it should be 20%. Okay, so the result of this ternary operator here will be one of these values. So either bill times 0.15 or times 0.2. And so that's going to be the result of this operator. And so that's what this function will return. If you prefer the arrow function, we can also do that. So const calc tip equal bill. And now we can omit the return keyword and do it all in one nice line. So now you just have to choose which one you like better. And I will just, for the sake of readability, keep the first one there. Okay? But if you prefer the arrow function, you can just use this one. Great. So number 2 is to simply create a builds array with these 3 values. So builds 125, 555, and 44. So that was easy. And now we will create an array tips, which will contain the tip value for each bill. So let's do that. And now this is similar to what we did previously with calculating the ages. So we are going to create an array, and then each position will be the function call to calc tip. So we want to calc the tip with builds at position 0. Then at position 1, we want to calculate builds, or we actually want to calculate tips based on builds on position 1 and then on position 2. And that's it. So let's log both the builds and the tips to the console here. And that gives us tips is not defined. So here it should be tips. So usually when I have an array, I like to give it a plural name, like here builds and here tips. So because it's multiple values. So now that should work. And yeah, so these were the 3 tips that were calculated. And of course, you could have created separate values, or actually separate variables for each of these function calls, like tip 1 equals calc tip with builds 0, something like this, and then tip 2 and tip 3, and then you could have created like an array with tip 1, tip 2, and tip 3. Okay, so something like this. But my idea was to actually do it like this, because then we don't have to create all these extra variables. So that's a lot cleaner. Later on in the section, we will find an even better way of doing this. But with what we know at this point, this is the best that we can do. So we take the first bill, calculate the tip based on that, and put it in position number 0. Then we take builds at position number 1, calculate the tip, and put it in position 1 of this new array. And then we take builds at position number 2, calculate the tip, and put it at position 2 of the new array. And so then, yeah, we end up with this. Lastly, let's also complete the bonus question number 4 here. And all we have to do here is to create an array which will have the sum of the builds and the tips. So that's going to be totals. And now you might have tried to do something like this. So like builds plus tips. But as I told you in the previous lecture, this is simply not going to work. So we cannot do any operations on arrays like this. It doesn't work like that. So let me show you the result that we would get from doing this. And so basically, each of the arrays would be transformed to a string, and then the two strings would be concatenated. So that's completely useless. And so the only thing that we could do is to say that we want builds at position 0 plus the tips at position 0. And now we do this for all the three values. So at position 1 as well, and then at position 2. And so this fixes this error, because now in each position we do actually have a real value, because this is an actual value, and so with that we can then do calculations. So yeah, this is correct, looks correct, right? And yeah, so with that, all of the 4 points are solved. And so here we conclude this part about arrays. So after arrays, it's now time to learn about another data structure in JavaScript, which is objects. So up until this point, we have been using arrays as a data structure to basically store multiple related values in the same variable. So let's just quickly recap that. So Jonas array, and you don't need to write this code. Okay, I'm really just trying to recap here. So we had the first name, and you see that I'm writing this in multiple lines now, and that is perfectly acceptable. So sometimes that's easier to give us an overview of a data structure, as long as we remember the commas here after each of the elements, we're going to be fine. So then we have kind of this age calculation here. Then we had the job and even an array of friends. So we have an array inside an array. So Michael, Peter, and Stephen. So again, this is basically a data structure which combines multiple values which all belong to this Jonas entity. Now we know intuitively that this first element here of the array should be called the first name. And this one is the last name. This one could be called age. This one could be called job. And this one could be called the friends. But in arrays, there's no way of giving these elements a name. And so we can't reference them by a name, but only by their order number in which they appear in the array. And so to solve that problem, we have another data structure in JavaScript, which is objects. So in objects, we actually define key value pairs. And so then we can give each of these values here a name. So let's see how. So again, we're defining a variable. And so I'm calling this one Jonas now. And then this is the actual object. So now instead of the square brackets that we use for arrays, we use the curly brackets or curly braces. So this is the second time we're seeing the curly braces. First, we saw them to define a code block, for example, in an if-else statement or if a switch statement, or even to define a function body. But this is different. Okay, so these curly braces here are to define a new object. And so let's now fill up this object with key value pairs. So the key is basically the variable name. So let's say first name, then a colon, and then the value. And the value can be of any type that we want here. Then to define another key value pair, we just separate them with commas, just like in the array. So last name, and then colon, remember, Schmedtmann, then the age, and once more, we can put any expression here. So this will be calculated and then will be assigned to age. Then the job, which is teacher, and finally the friends. And let's just copy this array from here. Okay, and so with this we have now an object which contains 5 key value pairs. So again, these are the 5 keys, and then each key has a value. And so essentially with this, we were able to assign a name to each of these values that we had. So that's something that was impossible in arrays, but now it is possible. Now each of these keys is also called a property. So we say that this object here, so this object, which is called Jonas, has 5 properties. So property first name with the value of Jonas, property last name with the value of Schmedtmann, and so on and so forth. Now, objects are probably the most fundamental concept in the whole JavaScript language. So there are many ways of creating objects. And simply writing an object in the code like this is probably the simplest way of creating an object. So here with the curly braces. So there are multiple ways of creating objects, but again, using the curly braces like this is the easiest one, and it's called the object literal syntax, because we are literally writing down the entire object content. So to recap, just like arrays, we use objects to essentially group together different variables that really belong together, such as the properties of Jonas that we've been working with. Now, the big difference between objects and arrays is that in objects, the order of these values does not matter at all when we want to retrieve them. And that's important to keep in mind. So in arrays, the order in which we specify the elements matters a lot, because that's how we access these elements, right? So we can only access array elements using their order number. This means that we should use arrays for more ordered data and objects for more unstructured data, and data that we actually want to name and then retrieve from the object based on that name. But how do we actually do that? So how do we get data from an object? And that's exactly what the next lecture is about. In this video, you're gonna learn how to retrieve data from objects and also how to change data in objects using both the dot and the bracket notation. So let's actually get the object here from the previous lecture. So that's Jonas object. And I noticed that we actually didn't even take a look at it in the console. So let's quickly log it. But we're actually not gonna see a big surprise. So all it shows us is really this same object that we just wrote in code. So it looks like this. So essentially just as it is here in the code. The only thing that's different is that the properties here are ordered alphabetically. And so that's what I mean when I said in the last lecture that the order of properties does not matter. And that's because we simply get the properties from the object using the property name itself. So that's actually the topic of this video. And so let me show you the 2 ways in which we do that. So the first way of getting a property from an object is by using the dot notation. And that is very straightforward. So let's log that to console. And so let's say that we want to get the last name. So all we have to do is to write Jonas dot last name. And that's it. You see, here is my last name coming straight from the Jonas object. So Jonas dot last name. And this dot here is actually an operator which will go to this object and then retrieve the property with the name that we specified here. Now we can do the exact same thing using the brackets notation. So let me show that as well. So Jonas, and then we use brackets in a similar way in which we retrieve data from an array, but here we need to specify a string with the property name, so with the key. So let's do my name again, or actually last name, and so these results should be exactly the same here. Now the big difference between these two here is that in the bracket notation, here we can actually put any expression that we'd like. So we don't have to explicitly write the string here, but instead we can compute it from some operation. because remember that an operation is basically an expression, so something that produces a value, and so we can put that here inside the brackets. So let's actually try that, and imagine that we had a variable in which we store the repeating part in first name and last name. So we have name here in both, and so let's store just that inside of a variable. And you will see my point here in a second. This will all make sense, trust me. So name key, and then just name. So again, that's the repeating part in these two property names. And now we can use that variable to get both the first and the last name. So console.log, and then Jonas, brackets. And so now here we can insert the expression. So let's create a string first and concatenate it with name key. And here we could have built this string using a template literal, but in this case, it's not really necessary. So let's just copy this and then also last. So what will happen here is that as JavaScript sees this line of code, it will start by executing this plus operation, and so it will create the string first name. And then it will go to the Jonas object and retrieve that property. And the same for the last name here in the second line of code. And so that's how we get Jonas and Schmedtmann. And doing something like this is more common than you might think. And so that's why it's important that we understand that in the square brackets, we could put any expression here. Okay? Now the same thing would not work with the dot operator or the dot notation. So we cannot write Jonas dot and then this here, for example. This would not work at all. So, an unexpected string. And so that's the reason why we need the brackets notation. In dot notation, we have to use the real final property name and not a computed property name. So, for example, this one. This one is a real property name as it appears in the object. And so that's why it works here in this case. So, in what situations should we use the dot notation, and when do we have to use the brackets notation? And I kind of already replied to that, but this is just to recap. So when we need to first compute the property name, like we did here with the first and last name, then of course we have to use the bracket notation. In any other case, just use the dot notation, which looks a lot cleaner and is also easier to use. Okay? And now to make the need for the bracket notation even more clear, let me show you another example, which I think is going to be really fun. So let's say that we don't know yet which property we want to show. And instead we get this information from some user interface. So for that we can use the prompt function, remember. So we can use prompt, and prompt is yet another built-in function that is built into JavaScript and that we can use in any script. So here we can write a string, and then this will create a pop-up window with an input field, remember? So here we can write, what do you want to know about Jonas? Choose between first name, last name, age, job, and friends. And remember that this function will then return a string, and this string we just need to store into some variable. So let's call this one interested in. All right. And to start, let's just log this interested in value to the console here, just so we see that it actually works. And so here is the pop-up. And so now we just write one of these options here. So let's say job. And indeed, now here we get job. And so what we want to do now is to basically display the job here in the console, because that's what the user chose. So how will we do that? Can we use the dot notation? So basically, can we do this, Jonas.interested_in? Well, let's find out. But I hope that you can guess. And so we get undefined. And this is something new that I didn't explain yet. And so let me tell you now that undefined is what we get when we try to access a property on an object that does not exist. So Jonas does not have a property called interested_in, right? And so therefore, the result of trying to access interested_in on Jonas is undefined. Now, what we need to do here is, instead of the dot notation, use the brackets notation. Because then we can put any expression here, which in this case will be interested_in. And so JavaScript will now come here and replace interested_in with the actual value of the variable, and then that's the one that will be looked up on the Jonas object. So let's try that again. And now, when I say job, we get the correct result. Great. And I hope that you did understand the big difference between using the dot notation and the bracket notation, and why the bracket notation gave us the correct result. So again, it's because basically this expression that we put here between these brackets will get evaluated. And then this one here is job. Now, of course, we can also pass in something else, so something that is not here. For example, let's try to access the location, and then again we get undefined. And once more, that is because there is not a property called location on the object. So let's actually handle that using some knowledge that we already have. So we know that undefined is a falsy value, right? And so we can use that to our advantage now and create some logic that will print a custom string whenever the user tries to access a property that doesn't exist. So let's do that. And we can say, if Jonas brackets interested_in, then log that to the console. So basically this. And again, I'm using now the option and arrow down to move this line. And so if this value exists, then it is a truthy value because it is not undefined. And so any string that is not empty or any number that is not 0 will then trigger this code block here to be executed. Now, if one of these properties was actually empty or 0, we would then go to the else block, but let's not account for that here in this case. Let's say that doesn't happen. All right. So in case that the value does not exist, so for example with location, we then get undefined. And so in this case, Jonas interested_in is undefined, which is false, and therefore we would go to the else block. And so let's say something like wrong request, and then we can repeat this sentence here. So let's try that again here. So location, and now we get wrong request. But if we try something that exists, then we get that result. Great. So I think this was a fun little experiment here, and yeah, I hope you liked that. And now that you know how to retrieve elements from an object, let's also learn how to use both the dot and the brackets notation to add new properties to the object. So that's pretty straightforward. So all we have to do is Jonas dot, and now let's actually use location and set it equal to something, so to some value. So I'm located in Portugal, and so that's how we use the dot notation. And then we can also, of course, use the brackets notation just the same. So let's say my Twitter handle here, which is @Jonas Schmedtmann with just one N. And you should definitely check that out. And now just to see that it worked, let's log it to the console one final time. And okay, it's asking us for the field name again. But anyway, now we have the location and the Twitter here as well in the object. And of course, here we could put any expression just like before. So it works in the exact same way. All right. And that's how we use the brackets and the dot notation. Now, finally, I have one small challenge for you that you can just do right now here at the end of this video. And so what I want you to do is to write a sentence like this one that I'm going to show you now, but in a dynamic way. So let's just write challenge here. And so I want you to write, Jonas has 3 friends and his best friend is called Michael. So here we suppose that the first friend in the array, so in the friends array, is the best friend. Okay, and for the record, I do have more than 3 friends, but of course here we need to keep it all very simple. So again, I want you to write this sentence, but without hard coding any of these values. So what you need to get from the object is this value, and this value. And this is actually a bit hard, I would say. And so there's absolutely no need for you to nail this. But you can still try it, and maybe you can do some of the parts. One hint that I can give you is that you will need to use multiple dots to get the number of friends. Okay, so that's totally possible. And so take like 5 minutes to try this out now. So pause the video and I'll see you in a second. All right. And so this is how we would do this. So we want to log this to the console, of course. And so we're starting with the name. And this one is probably the most straightforward one. So that's just Jonas.first name. So that is where the name is stored. Then has, and then the number of friends. So the friends are stored in Jonas.friends. Now, do you remember how to get the number of elements in an array? It is by writing the array .length, right? And so let's do that. So Jonas.friends, and so this is our array, right? And so on this array, we can now ask for the length. And so basically you can see here that length is also a property that is available on all arrays. So it's a property that we don't define ourselves, but it's automatically available. But now that you know about the dot notation, you can also start to understand that the dot length is just a property that is available on all arrays. And so that's what we're doing here. So again, we have an array, which is this one. And on there, we can simply then request dot length. Okay, let's continue the sentence now. And his best friend is called, and now we need to simply get the first element from the array. So that's again Jonas.friends. And now remember, we get the first element of an array using square brackets 0. And that's it. So once more, this here is simply an array. And so we learned that to take the first element, we just use square brackets with 0. So in a sense, on arrays, we also have the brackets notation. Okay, so let's just test this. And again, this annoying pop-up. But indeed, Jonas has 3, and we're just missing the friends here. So friends, and his best friend is called Michael. So just what I had written here as a template. Now in terms of operator precedence, let's quickly check out why it actually works this way. So with the dots here. Because remember, as I said, the dot operator here is really just that. It's just an operator. And the same goes for the brackets. So I will again Google MDN operator precedence, but the link to this table is also on the resources pages on my website. And the link to that one is right in the first text lecture of the course. But anyway, here we have the dot notation, which here is called member access. And then we have the brackets notation, which is here called computed member access. And so the computed is because, as I mentioned multiple times now, because we can compute the property names that we want to access. Now what matters here is that they both have a really high priority and both are left to right. And so that's why all of this works. So we have two dots here. So Jonas.friends.length, and they are executed left to right. And therefore, the first thing that JavaScript does is Jonas.friends. And so essentially, this will then be replaced with the array. And then on that array is where the dot length is then applied. And the same thing here. So first, Jonas.friends is done. And then this one is also left to right. And so from there, we take element number 0. Okay, so there's no magic involved here. There is rules for everything, and everything makes sense. And again, you don't need to memorize this here. With time, all of this will become second nature to you. Let's keep exploring objects. And this lecture will bring us to object methods. So we learned that objects, just like arrays, can hold different types of data. And they can hold even arrays, and in fact, they could even hold objects inside objects. But now we can take it even further. And for that, remember how I said that functions are really just another type of value. And if a function is just a value, then that means that we can create a key-value pair in which the value is a function. And that then means that we can, in fact, add functions to objects. And so let's now see how. And once more, I will get back this object here, but we will change it up a little bit this time around. So here, let's simplify and just put the birth year. So just 1991. And I also want to add a Boolean here. As driver's license. Just to show you that we can hold all kinds of different data types in one object. But now let's also add a function here as a key value pair. So to do that, all we have to do is to add another key here. And the function that we want to add is again the forEach function. So that's one of the favorites, as you can see, but it is because it's a very simple calculation that we can do with the birth year. So to do that, let's simply add the name basically of the function here as a key. So as a property, so forEach, and then the colon. And now here we simply specify the function as an expression. And that works because the expression produces the value. And so we can just do this. So function, and just like before, we pass in the birth year, and we return 2037 minus the birth year that was passed in. So this is pretty similar to simply writing this, right? So a regular function expression. So const forEach like this. This is how we used to do it before. And so you see that this is pretty similar. The difference is just in the syntax, because now forEach is not a regular variable like here, but it's a property of the Jonas object. And so therefore we use the colon here, but the rest here is exactly the same. And so that's why it was very important that you understood what a function expression actually is. Because here we need the function expression to create this method. And that's what this function is called. So any function that is attached to an object is called a method. So of course we could have not used a function declaration here. So something like this. So function forEach, for example, that would not work we would certainly get an error here. So unexpected token function, because this is a declaration, and so it doesn't work here. Here we need an expression, and so this will work indeed. Okay, does this make sense? So if you can think of functions as simply being values, then you can see that a method is actually also a property. It just happens to be a property that holds a function value. So here we have a string value, here we have an array value, here we have a Boolean value, and here we have a function value. All right? So I hope that's logical. And now, just like we can access any other property, we can also access the forEach property or method. So Jonas.forEach. And so forEach is now the function value. And just like any other function, in order to call it, we use the parentheses. And now we can pass in the year here, and so that should then calculate our age. And let's just log this result to the console here, just to see if everything works. And it does indeed. Okay. And you could also have accessed this method using the bracket notation. Because again, it's just as if it was a normal property. And the brackets would actually be necessary here, so that this then here is the function, and then we call the function using the parentheses. So let's try that. And yeah, here this needs to be a string. So like I showed you in the last lecture, and now here we get 46 as well. Okay, so just like I showed you in the last video with the operator precedence table, the first thing that happens here is that Jonas.forEach is computed. And so this here will become the function value. And then with the parentheses, we call that function value here and pass in 1991. And the same thing here. So here we access the property forEach using the brackets, and then this here will basically be replaced with the function, and then we call the function right here, just like before. All right. Now, you might have noticed that the birth year 1991 that we passed here as an argument to the method is actually already defined in the Jonas object itself up here, right? So we already have this information in the Jonas object. And so writing the same number here and here is not ideal, because we might make a mistake and pass in the wrong year. For example, right here. So Jonas's birth year is 91, but here we could, for some reason, accidentally do 92, and then it would be wrong. And even if we do not make any mistake, this is still not ideal, because we are not keeping the code dry. So we're violating the don't repeat yourself principle. So if we know the birth year of Jonas, it should only be written in one place, not in multiple places. Because if that might change, then we have to change it everywhere. That's always the philosophy that we need to keep in mind. So what if we could actually access this birth year property directly from the Jonas object instead of having to pass it in? Well, it turns out that we actually can. And that's because in every method, JavaScript gives us access to a special variable called this. And so what we can do now is in this forEach function, we can read the birth year directly from this object itself without having to pass it in as a parameter here into this function. All right. So let me copy this and comment this one out, just so that we keep a record of what we did. But this here will be the new version. So now we no longer need this parameter, and we will read the birth year directly from the object. And for that, again, we will use the this keyword. So the this keyword, or the this variable, is basically equal to the object on which the method is called. Or in other words, it is equal to the object calling the method. So let's see who is calling the method. So down here, here is calcH, and the object that is calling the method is Jonas, because that's where the dot is. And let's forget about this one. I'll actually comment it out here. And so, again, the object that is calling the calcH method here is Jonas. And so that means that inside this method, the this variable or the this keyword will point to Jonas. And so let me just write this.birthyear here, and then I can explain it even a little bit better. So here we don't need to pass the 1991 here, and I will run this now, and we still get the correct result. So great. And to make this even more clear here, let's also log this to the console. And indeed, this is the whole Jonas object. And so again, that's because the Jonas object is the one who is calling this method, so this function. See here, it's jonas.calcH. And so whatever appears before the dot is the one who is calling the method. And so therefore, in the method, this points to Jonas now. And if this points to Jonas, then this.birthyear is of course this value that we have right here. Great. So you see that the this keyword is something really, really useful. And we will learn even more about the this keyword in greater detail in a later section. For now, I just wanted to introduce you to this concept. And I know this can be a bit confusing, so really make sure to maybe pause the video and really analyze what's happening here. Maybe you can even rewind a little bit and hear my explanation again. That might be useful too. Now, you might argue that maybe we don't even need this confusing this keyword. Why not just do Jonas.birthyear here instead? Well, because that would actually still violate the don't repeat yourself principle. It would work just the same here now, but then let's say that we need to change the name of the object. So we change it here to Jonas2, and then we call Jonas2 down here. And then the code will no longer automatically work. Because now Jonas is not defined, of course. And so we would have to keep that in mind and then come here and manually change this as well. While if we had the this keyword, then everything will keep working without us having to change it there. Because now this will simply point to Jonas2, because that is the object calling the method. And so therefore, it's always a good idea to reference the object itself and not hard-code the name of the object. So let's put it back to Jonas. And yeah, much better. So this works great already, and we're really going into some more advanced territory here. So I hope you're still following me and you're still making sense of everything. However, we can actually even take this a little bit further. But don't worry, it's not going to get a lot more confusing. Just a small variation of this. Because let's say that we need to access the age multiple times throughout our program. So that would be like calling this a couple of times. So let's say in 3 places of our application, we need to access the age. And so, of course, this will work. And indeed it does. And it always logs the Jonas object because we still have this here. So this makes it a bit easier to view. And so what happens here is that the function will get called a total of 4 times. And so this computation here will be done 4 times. And in this case, that's not a big deal, but it might be like a heavier computation that actually takes some more time. And so it would be a bad practice to do this multiple times. Instead, what we can do is to just calculate the age once, then store it in the object, and then when we need it at a later point, we can then just retrieve the age as a property from the object. So I hope you're following me here. So I will again copy this and comment it out so that we keep all the 3 versions that we did here. So what I was trying to say is that we can now use the this keyword also to store a new property. So we can say this.h is equal to this here. So we calculate the h, and then we create a new property on the current object. So in this case, on the Jonas object. And remember that we can use the dot notation like this to create new properties. So we did that in the previous lecture as well. Where was that? Yeah, right here. So here we created Jonas.location and set it to Portugal. And so here we are essentially creating Jonas.h and setting it to this h that we just calculated. And then we can simply return this h. And of course, we don't even need to return anything if we didn't want to. We could make this method only calculate the h, but not even return it. But I think it's a good practice to actually also return it. And so now here we can replace the function call with simply a request for the h property. And notice this trick that I did here again with the command D, right? So this gives me multiple cursors, and then I can do one operation in multiple places at the same time. So that's a really handy shortcut. So again, command D or control D, and in the menu bar, that means add next occurrence. So let's test this, and the result should be the same. And it is. But we only needed to calculate the h once. Then from here, we simply retrieve the property that we had already calculated before. And so this is the most efficient solution, let's say. All right, and now I actually have another small challenge for you that you can do just in this video. So I want you to write a method called getSummary, and this method should return a string which should kind of summarize the data about Jonas. Or, of course, any other person data that you might have used. For example, let me again, actually we can get rid of this. So let me write challenge here again, and then do an example string. So I want you to write, for example, this. Jonas is a 46-year-old teacher. And we now could actually add all the data here to the string, but that would be too much work. And I'm a bit lazy now. So let's just also say if I have a driver's license or not. So Jonas is a 40-year-old teacher, and he has a driver's license. And it says that I have a driver's license because has driver's license is true. But if it was false, then here it should say, and he has no driver's license. So it's either A or no. So figure out how you can do that. And so I hope you managed to do it. It's a bit similar to what we did in the previous lecture, but this time I want you to actually write a method on your own. So give this a try, and I see you here in a second. Okay, so let's add getSummary. And remember that you need to have a comma between the properties. And so that's true also with methods. So here we need a comma, and then just a function. And it will then get all this data, of course, from the current object. So actually, let's first call this method. So, and we're doing it inside of console.log because, of course, we want to be able to see the summary string as a message in the console. So Jonas.getSummary. Okay, so which is the object calling the method? It is Jonas. And so therefore, the this keyword inside of getSummary will be Jonas. So I hope that this one is clear at this point. So let's now build a string here. And starting with the name, it is at this dot first name is a, and now the h. So this And now what do we do here? Should we use the age property, or should we do calcH? Well, I would say that we should do calcH because we cannot assume that calcH was already called before. Okay, and if we don't call calcH before we call getSummary, then the age property would not exist. And so it's better to actually do calcH here. And so I think we did this before. So in a template string, we can easily do a function call. That's not a problem at all. So this.calcH will call this other method, and this will then return the age. All right. And maybe it might be strange for you to call the function also on this, but well, the rule is just exactly the same. This is Jonas in this object. And so this is essentially the same as writing it here. All right. So this will become the age. And so here, old, and now the job, Jonas.job. And he has, and now we need to decide between a and no. So let's do a ternary operator here. So we get this.driver's license. And basically, if it's true, then we want the result of this operator to be a. And if not, we want it to be no. And then driver's license. Okay, makes sense? So again, here we want either a or no, depending on the state of the hasDriver's license property. So we get that property by calling this.hasDriver's license. And here we're using the ternary operator. And so if this first part is true, then the result of the operator will be a. And otherwise, the result will be no. And so that's what will then be put into this place of the sentence. Okay. And we already called the method down here, and we logged it to the console. And so I think this should work now. And it does. So Jonas is a 46-year-old teacher, and he has a driver's license. Now just to test, let's set it to false. And now, and he has no driver's license. Beautiful. Okay. And yeah, that's all the code that I had to show you in this video. And now just to finish the lecture, which I know is already running quite long, but I want to basically build a bridge between this method and the array method lecture. So remember that we used methods on arrays previously. So we can quickly go there. So it was before this challenge. Yes, indeed. So for example, here we have friends.push. And so we have an array, and on there we call a method. So just like we did in this video. Now what this means is that arrays are actually also objects. They're just a special kind of object. And so they have functions, or in other words, they have methods that we can use to manipulate them, like push, pop, shift and unshift, and many more. All right. So in this lecture, we created our own methods on our own objects. But here we basically used built-in methods on arrays. And so once again, that means that arrays are actually also objects. That's why they can have methods as well. And we will dive deeper into why things work like this. But I wanted you to realize this early on in the course. This is quite a complex topic. And so there is really a very exciting journey still ahead of you. So I hope you're enjoying this journey so far. And now to test your knowledge, there is coding challenge number 3 coming up next. Okay, so let's get to work. So number 1 is creating an object for each of them. So object mark So full name property, Mark Miller. Then the mass, which is 78 kilograms, and then the height, which is 1.69 meters. So that's it for now. And now I'm just gonna copy this. As always, I'm a bit lazy, and that's just how programmers are, I guess. So John Smith, and he is 92 kilos and 195 meters tall. Okay, so that is point number 1. And now we will create the calc BMI method. And then a function without any parameters, because we will take the data directly from the object, just like we did it with the calc_h method previously. And remember that it says here that we should store the BMI value to a property and also return it from the method. So this means that we will do this dot BMI and then do the calculation here. And remember, from the formula, the BMI is calculated by this dot mass divided by this dot height squared. So exponentiation operator with 2. And then also return it. So this dot BMI. And just to see if this actually works, let's actually call this method. So mark.calc BMI. And now I will quickly log to the console the property that we just created. So I could have logged this to the console directly, but I want to do it this way now, and it doesn't really matter. So with this, remember, we created a property called BMI. And so that is now, of course, accessible here. So mark.bmi, because remember that here in this method, this now points to Mark, because that is the object that is calling the method. And therefore, this.bmi will be on Mark. So mark.bmi equals mark.mass divided by mark.height. And so that's how we get this data into this method. All right, so that's essentially what we learned in the last lecture. And so here I'm doing the same. I'm first calculating this value, and then I'm doing mark.bmi, which was added here in this method call. Of course, without this method call, mark.bmi would not be available, because this method here doesn't call itself. We need to explicitly call it. Now console, missing the .log. How can that still happen after all these years? Okay, so here we get the BMI of 27, which seems about right. And now, as I said, we will simply go ahead and copy this method exactly the same to this John object, and it will work just the same. Believe me. So let me show that to you. So now we call John.calcBMI. And so now the object calling calcBMI is John. And so now in this method here, this will point to the John object. And so this time, John.bmi will be calculated using John's data of mass and height. Okay, are you still following that? As always, you can pause the video, analyze the code on your own, or you can always rewind to hear the explanation again. I actually like to do that myself when I watch other online video courses. So I think that's a good tip, maybe. Anyway, so we just calculated the BMI of John here as well. And so now I'm logging both to the console. And so, yeah, this one also looks correct. And so this means that simply copying this method from one place to the other actually makes it work and adapt to the data of each object. Now, having the exact same code in both of these objects kind of violates the don't repeat yourself principle, right? And actually, there is a way in which we can avoid this. And of course, we will learn how at a later point in the course using something called object-oriented programming. But for now, we are still learning the basics and just want to make things work. And of course, have some fun along the way. So this was the hardest part, I believe at least. Now all we have to do is to write this string here. Let me actually copy the example so we have it as a reference down here. Otherwise, I'm going to get a bit lost. So, if mark.bmi is larger than john.bmi, then console.log. So let's get the full name now from the object. So mark.fullname bmi, and now we also need it here in these parentheses. So let's put it there. Mark.bmi is higher than, and now let me just copy it here. So, and again, I'm using Command D to select the next occurrence, and then let's just replace it with John. So Mark's BMI is higher than John's BMI. And now let's grab this again. Else, if John BMI is larger than Mark.BMI, then essentially say the opposite. So here it's going to be John, and again Command D, and here it's going to be Mark. Okay. So 27 is higher than 24, and that 27 belongs to Mark, and so this seems to be about right, but it's not completely right. So, of course, here it should be lowercase. So BMI, and now I cannot use the Command D because then it will select this one as well. So I'm double clicking on this one, and I hope that you're finding these VS Code tips useful as well. So I'm clicking, or actually I'm double clicking on this one, then I hold down the Command key, which in your case might be the Control key or maybe the Option key. So I know there are different configurations for this, and it might not even work for you, so please don't ask any question in that case. But for me, I just have to hit Command, and then I can double click on multiple words, and then all of them get selected. So now I have these 4 multiple cursors here again, and I can simply delete all of them and write the one that I'm interested in. So that's the lowercase BMI, and now we get the correct values. And also this conditional logic is correct as well. And so with this, we did actually solve the challenge. And with this, we also finished this introduction to JavaScript objects. And once again, I really want to congratulate you for the progress that you're making here. Great job and really well done. And I really mean it because I know how hard it is to stick to a course like this and to learn a completely new thing that is probably a bit confusing for you at this point still. Just keep in mind that that is absolutely no problem at all. And actually, in the next section, I believe, I have a video about how to learn, basically. So about learning how to code. And there's a lot of great tips that I'm sharing there. So once you reach that, make sure to watch it carefully. But now, anyway, I will leave you to review this lecture if you want, or to move on together with me to the next video, where we're now going to start talking about loops.